from verse 13, which is what we ended at. I want to make that point, excuse me, one more time. Matthew 24, verse 13. It says, "But he who endures to the end." So we've just heard all of these really frustrating aspects of what's happening at this time in the future. We've heard all of these things that really could just set our knees to knocking because they're scary. I mean, frankly, they're just scary. When you're hearing about nations rising against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms, earthquakes, wars, all these things spell kind of a disastrous world, and pestilences. And we talked about how we're kind of in the midst of one of those things right now, because a pestilence is either an epidemic or a pandemic. It can come in either form. It's either something that's sweeping over everyone as a terrible, think the drug epidemic. It's addiction based. It's also disease based, not just disease of the heart and the emotion and the mind, but literal disease of the body. Infection and an illness. I mean, when you start hearing all this and it says all of this is just the beginning of sorrows, and then it starts focusing in, it starts focusing in on false prophets rising up. And gosh, I mean, by the time you get done reading the first 12 verses of Matthew 24, it's a bleak picture. It's heavy. It's really heavy, and it can be frightening. And then it says in the scripture, verse 13, "But he who endures to the end shall be saved." And one of the last things we talked about the previous Wednesday was that Greek word endure, hupomeno. And it's the idea of holding your ground in conflict, of being able to bear up against adversity and stress. And not just any adversity, not just any stress, but the stuff that will really rattle your bones, being able to develop the thick skin. And here's the thing. I have said this 1,000 times myself, and it's very easy to fall into it, but we sometimes use that lovely phrase, "it is what it is." How many times have you ever used, "it is what it is"? And there's resignation in that. It's sort of like, it's going to be what it's going to be, and I can't affect any change. Here's the thing. That word endure is not just about being passive and resigned to your fate. It's beyond patience. It's beyond all of that. It's actually active. That kind of endurance, it's active, it's energetic, and it's not being resigned, but it's actually being resistant. And that's a completely different way of looking at it. To say I'm resigned to something is, well, it's going to steamroll me and I'll just let it. To resist is, it's coming for me. I recognize that. I see that wheel. It's huge. But I'm going to plant my feet, and I'm going to put my hands out, and I'm going to push with all of my might. And maybe I may not accomplish much, but I'm choosing to be active and not passive. Jesus is saying, if you are able to endure, if you are able to fight against it, if you are able to resist the temptation to lose your faith, if you're able to resist the temptation to fall into the trap of fear, which really is like a strangulation grip, if you're able to get that boldness in your soul that allows you to not only remain calm, but also allows you to be brave as you endure, that's the stuff that's going to keep you in the face of all of the nightmarish things you're reading before. That's why he says, don't be deceived and don't be worried. He actually tells them this. Don't fear. Stay calm. Stay calm. Verse 14, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." Why is that there? That's very odd placement, but it's not. Because the reality of the matter is, if you and I are gripped by a fear of what is to come, we will paralyze ourselves. We will become paralyzed. We will go and frantically get a bunch of shovels and dig a bunker. We will go to Wally World and get the 25-year packs of, the practical MREs, okay? and we will get as much bottled water as we possibly can, buy out all the toilet paper, go in our bunker and hide ourselves away and never do another thing for God. Because we're gripped. We're gripped by a fear that says, I can't hack it, I can't do it. Why bother? It's going to mow me over. My efforts are going to be for naught. And Jesus is saying, absolutely not, because if you get that bravery and that courage and that understanding that forewarned is forearmed, now I know and can confidently say the gospel of the kingdom is going to continue to be preached in the darkest hour. Because you will be resistant. You will be courageous. You will be prepared. Turning point. There's a turning point, and it's verse 15. Somebody read Matthew 24, verse 15 for me. I'm going to explain something kind of cool because this is almost like a double prophecy, and I'll explain why. Matthew 24, verse 15. Anybody? It's not a complete thought. We've only taken a half sentence because it says, therefore, when you see these things, and we kind of leave it on that cliffhanger, that's okay. I want to discuss the cliffhanger because the question is, what is the abomination of desolation and how do you recognize it? When you see the abomination of desolation, very strange terminology. But he gives us a clue because he says, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Okay. So when we delve into the book of Daniel, somebody pull up Daniel 12 and 11 and read it to us. Daniel 12 and 11. Daniel 12 and 11. $1,290 days is about 3.5 years. Now, there's that phrase again, the abomination of desolation. Let me explain. Daniel wrote his book somewhere around 604 BC. If you're a note taker, write that number down because I want to explain the significance of that. He wrote his book somewhere in the range of 604 BC. When he made this comment, this prophecy at his time, because we're talking 604 BC, this is way before Jesus is born. Okay, Jesus is not on the scene at this point. Hundreds of years before Jesus is born, Daniel says that there's going to be this king that rises up. And if you read that entire chapter, he tells the story of it in very vivid detail. And he basically predicts that there's going to be, or prophesies, I should say, that there's going to be this king that's going to rise up, and he's going to do something absolutely dastardly in the temple. That the daily sacrifice is going to be taken away, and he's going to actually set up an abomination so bad in the midst of that temple that it makes it desolate. Anybody can define desolate for me? Oh, Alyssa, you are always my one to look up words. Go ahead and look up that word desolate. And as you do that, I'm going to pull up some information for you guys about something that happened years later. That's right. So whoever this is going to effectively make the temple a desert. It's going to be dead. It's going to be wasted. Sacrifices won't be happening in it. And whatever abomination he's going to commit in the middle of that temple is going to be so heinous that it pretty much sucks the life right out of the entire place. Well, what Daniel was predicting was something Daniel was never going to see. Because when it actually happened in history was the year 156 BC. 156 BC, specifically December 16th. December 16th, 156 BC. There was an interesting thing going on at this point. Basically, it occurs between the Old and, if you will, I'll say the New Testament. This is that gray area of history and time where God was not speaking. You know how we talk about those years of silence, where God just said nothing through a prophet? This is something that happened in that time. How many people here have ever heard of Alexander the Great? Good old Alex the Great. All right. Well, Alexander the Great rises up, but after him there are some not so great successors. And for the most part, they followed Alexander's policies, and Alexander's policies left enough room so that local princes, basically, would rule over some of the different tribes in the areas, but Jews were permitted to maintain their religious ways and their culture as long as they paid the required tributes. As long as they pay their tributes, their taxes, essentially. As long as you pay that, you're fine. I'll let you do what you want to do. That was Alexander the Great's approach. But his successors were a little bit, if you will, desirous of greater power and desirous of greater fear to be evoked by their presence in history. And so there was this crackdown. And during this crackdown, there was a man who rose up. He was the young son of Seleucus, and his name was Antiochus. If anybody wants to write it down, it's Antiochus. Antiochus the Fourth. He was also referred to as Antiochus Epiphanes. And this was a very interesting dude. As a matter of fact, what's kind of interesting is his if you will, secondary name, Epiphanes. If you change the spelling slightly, just slightly, Epiphanes was what he took on to call himself a manifested God. He was so full of himself, he felt like he was a God on earth. And so he gave himself that second name, Epiphanes, manifested God, right? And what people did is because of the way that he lived and the way that he led, he was so crazed, this guy, that people would make, believe it or not, graffiti on the wall. Graffiti has existed a very long time. Okay, and so back in the hundreds BC, they made these graffitied walls that showed like a picture of Antiochus and changed his name to Epiphanes. So they changed one letter, and it changed the word from manifest God to madman in their language. So they were literally trolling him on the city walls. But he was considered absolutely crazy. And one of the things that he did is he said, I'm going to unify the religions of this region. I'm going to compel everybody to worship me as the paramount God on earth, and I want them to worship the Greek god Zeus on top of that, and he can be the one who is above me. But I will basically comment that I'm the manifest God in that I am Zeus in flesh on earth. And so he sets up this whole thing, and he begins to rule with this disgustingly iron fist to the point where he put his own picture as a god on all the coins. He began to destroy the Jewish nation, absolutely put them under his bonds, make it impossible for them to worship, outlaw them being able to do sacrifices in the temple. There's the first peg. Sacrifices stopped in the temple. And then what he did on December 16th, 167 BC, is he came to this breaking point and he charged into the Jewish temple. I want you to imagine what this must have been like for the Jews. He charges into the Jewish temple and erects an altar to Zeus on top of the altar where the burnt offerings would happen. So in that area where the burnt sacrifices were supposed to be lifted up to God, Antiochus walks in, has Zeus sitting right on top of the burnt altar, and he brings in a pig and has its throat slit all over the altar. Because for him, that was the ultimate way to offend and put the Jews under his thumb. Because, of course, a pig is one of the most unclean animals to the Jewish people. This was the abomination that at the time made the temple desolate What does that have to do with what Jesus is saying? Because that is something that happened in 167. How does that point to the end times? All right. Here's the thing to understand. When Jesus in verse 15 says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. He's actually saying that a leader of some sort is about to come on the scene in the future, who is going to be just as bad as Antiochus, who's going to defile the temple just as badly, who is going to commit atrocities and call himself a god in flesh, just like the madman of 167 BC did. I call it a double prophecy because for Daniel, he's living in 600 looking forward about 400 and change years later, saying, a king's going to come and do this. And Jesus is looking backwards and saying, remember that king that Daniel prophesied about? That same spirit's coming back. And in the end, you will recognize it because it's that same spirit, that same attitude that elevates himself and tries to vanquish, in this particular case, Christianity. It's someone who's going to point to himself and say, I am God in flesh. This is scary when you think about it. Because Antiochus, he was pure evil. Let's continue. Verse 16, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. He's literally saying, run. When you see that, it's time to move. It's time to protect yourself. It's time to shelter yourself as much as you can. Be firm. Keep enduring. Be brave. But use wisdom and get yourself out of the way. Because when you see this, you know that there's going to be some trouble on the earth because this man's going to unleash it. Verse 21. It says, for then. For then. We love those moments because what it's basically saying is you will see this and then there's going to be a benchmark. And then some more will happen and another benchmark. And it's how you know how you're advancing in this. For then there will be great tribulation. Look up the word tribulation. I love to have her be our dictionary. I do that on purpose because I know a lot of these kinds of words are words we don't use in our modern conversations. So it's important to delve into them. Go ahead. That's right. That's what tribulation is. Here's what it says in verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. It's almost like when Matthew's writing these words, he has this moment where he says, this is going to be the worst it's ever been since the beginning of the earth. No, actually, it's going to be worse than even that. It's like he has this midstream hiccup in his thought process that says, no, really? When I think about it, we've never seen anything this bad. Whoa, okay. 22, and unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Now, I told you guys that I was going to make sure that when we get to our next segment, where we talk about tribulation in a little more depth, I'm going to give you the 3 different viewpoints. Those 3 different viewpoints are pre-tribulation, mid-tribulation, post-tribulation. These 3 phrases refer to when we think the rapture is going to happen. When is Jesus going to come and take us out of here? When's he going to capture away the church and get us out of Dodge so that we're not dealing with any of the nonsense anymore? Those are the 3 views. Some people believe that the scripture points to it's going to happen before all of this. We're going to get to avoid, as the church, all of the tribulation, the true great tribulation, the bad stuff. Then there are those who are mid-tribbers who say, to be honest with you, I think the church is going to see some of it, maybe not all of it, but we're probably going to get some of the tendrils of it. And then there are those who are post-trib, and man, they're radical. They're like, I'm going to have a bunker, and I'm going to be like dodging the Antichrist bullets, and then Jesus is going to save me right before I take one to the head. So, and this is, hey, I'm going to be very honest with you guys that all three viewpoints have scriptures that they lean into that they believe prove their position. That's why I think it's fair in the education process that we explore all three. Not because I think that I can definitively tell you precisely when it's happening. I can't. I can't tell you that because there's too much of a question mark and too many gray areas and factors that I don't fully understand, even as a student of the Word, to be able to predict. And I don't think the point of this is prediction. The point of studying prophecy is to understand that there is a winning side, and you can be on it. And the kind of attitude that you have to approach scary times with to not be overwhelmed. That's the point of prophecy in a crux. It's to point to Jesus Christ and Him crucified and remind us that there's still someone in control when it looks like chaos. But I will make a note, now that I've said that this verse 22, is what both mid-tribbers and post-tribbers use as a proving point. Because verse 22 says, unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, which most will translate to the church, the days will be shortened. Seems to suggest for people who ascribe to the mid-tribulation and post-tribulation view that the days are shortened because we are still here. And God doesn't want to put us through the worst of it. Verse 23, then if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, do not believe it. He's kind of starting again the same way. If you look back at verse 4 and 5, he says the same. Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name saying, I'm the Christ. So he's coming full circle. Here it comes again. For false Christ, verse 24, and false prophets will rise, here's the danger, and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible. There it is again, another piece that basically people who are mid-tribulation and post-tribulation view use and put in their back pocket, even the elect, meaning possibly even the church or the chosen ones of God. Can you imagine how difficult it would be and how sensitive you have to be to the voice of the Lord to have spiritual discernment if somebody is doing great signs and wonders right in front of you and miracles are actually happening? Wouldn't it be convincing if you had somebody who was there saying, it's me, I'm back. The Lord is with me. I'm a prophet of God. I'll prove it to you. And lame people walk. And the deaf have their hearing given to them. And the blind suddenly see. And the dead are raised. What do you do with that? And Jesus is forewarning us because he truly, as I said, wants us to be forearmed. Because he's saying, when you see all these things occurring, understand that is not the method or the means by which I'm going to come back. And when you see these things and you hear these things and people are coming and there's deception and you're seeing all these fantastic miracles and people saying that they're prophets and they're Christ and they're this and they're that, do not believe it in those days. Because all of that madness is there because the enemy is still attempting to deceive, even in the last moment, it seems to suggest, those who are within the church. Don't get wowed by everything you see. Don't get wowed by everything you see. Let me tell you something. When I was in the throes of paganism, it's not even, we know that we're definitely closer to the end of all things than they were back then, correct? So we edge closer. But I will say this. When I was a kid and my father was raising me in paganism, I saw miracles. I literally did. I saw witches and warlocks and voodoo priestesses and priests doing miraculous things. I saw people healed. I saw people's bodies actually change before my eyes. I saw it. The enemy is an imposter. And he does everything he can to seem legitimate, to seem valid. But the proof is in the tasting of the pie. And where it really is going to break down is in the words that are spoken, not the acts that are committed. Do not trust in splash and razzmatazz. Don't trust in it. When you see it and somebody says to you, well, isn't this proof positive? At this point in time, proof positive is only founded in what is legitimately aligning with the Word of God and the voice of God. Because everything else in this period of time is going to be smoke and mirrors. And we need to be careful that we don't get caught up in all the sensations that happen. Because it's going to be a sensational time. Verse 25, look at what Jesus says. See, I've told you beforehand. It's almost like he's pausing again to say, I'm warning you. Because I don't want anybody to pull the wool over your eyes. I don't want you to be unprepared. Because unprepared people, listen, I've been unprepared in my life for things. A bill will come, let's say, here's one we all probably know about. A car breaks down, right? Like, been there. I've had cars taken away. Who am I kidding? Okay? Hey. And then what happens? You start making desperate moves because you're unprepared. Unprepared people make moves out of a desire to make the pain stop. Unprepared people make moves in a desire to make the fear stop. Unprepared people make moves to make chaos stop. And they don't always, I say this with experience, let me not say they, I did not always make my wisest decision in that time. I jumped on things, man, I might as well have just jumped on a grenade because by the time it was all said and done, I was blown apart. But it's what I did because I thought my back is against the wall and I have no other choice. And this is the key I want to tell you about prophecy. That Jesus is warning us beforehand so you know, and so I know, yes, I do still have a choice. I do not have to fall victim to any of the madness. I do not have to be swept away in the storm. I do not have to bow under the pressure of this thing because I know how the story ends. If I will just stick it out. Not saying it's not going to be a crunch. And I'm not saying that there isn't going to be pain and fear associated with it. We are, after all, humans. We are prone to the full, vivid, technicolor version of all of our emotions. That's how it is in the human experience. We still feel. We still wonder. We still question. We still doubt. But he's still piercing through all of that and saying it over and over. Don't fear. I'm warning you. I'm giving you the whole lay of the land ahead of time. I don't want you to go into it blind. Continuing on. Verse 26, therefore, in light of everything you've read, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, do not go out. Or, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Very interesting line. Let me pause here. What he's basically saying is, when I come, I'm not coming quietly. You're not going to have to scuttle out to the desert to come see some dude who's, put up his tent and is, preaching and things are happening. No, he's saying, no. Don't go into some inner room because somebody with a little carrot on the end of a stick is saying, all the good stuff is in here. I know exactly where Jesus is. I know where the work of God is happening. He's saying, don't follow that. Because when I come, I'm coming on the scene in power and authority, and I'm making my entrance obvious. And it is not going to be in these other ways. He's not manifesting himself in flesh again, coming to earth to do miracles and, kiss babies and make food for hungry people. That is not what he's doing the second time round, guys. The second time round, he's coming in judgment and in power, and he's splitting the sky. The trumpet is going to sound, the earth is going to shake, and it's going to give up its dead. It's a vastly different scene, and nobody is going to be able to mimic that. When Jesus comes the second time, and he actually takes away his bride, we leave. We don't party on and just watch him put on charades. We get out. And he's sort of saying, don't get lost in the weeds. Don't get lost in the weeds thinking I'm coming down to hang. That is not what's happening. Verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Okay, dramatic. Again, we're talking about nature begins to move, something vastly different. Not parlor tricks, not party games. Nature begins to have a near violent and abnormal response. Verse 30. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. They'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. That's the reference to the rapture. And they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. I will get into this in greater detail when we actually cover the scriptures that talk about the rapture and what that looks like. Verse 32. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. Look at him switching gears. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer's near. What he's basically saying is, time out. You live with seasons all throughout your life. All of us live with seasons. Now, granted, I have come to find some seasons don't happen in abundance here in Idaho the way that I knew them on the East Coast. Like, y'all don't really care for fall or spring much, it seems. You guys kind of go winter, 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 semi-winter, heat, heat, semi-cool, frost. Like that's kind of what it feels like here. But he's referring to legit seasons. You know that something's shifting because nature itself begins to point to it. The air starts to warm. Even the smells of the air begin to change. And all of a sudden, the thing that was dead starts to put forth a bud. And he says, so you also, when you see all these things, know that it is near, at the doors. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words, there's the focus. Not acts, not powerful displays necessarily, but the words of Christ himself, his teachings, his assurances, all that he said to us will by no means pass away. Verse 36, I'm going to continue a little further. Verse 36, but of that day and hour. Here we go. Let me ask you guys something. Have you ever been able to say, forget the calendar, okay? We have first day of spring, first day of summer, first day of fall. Forget it, because we generalize that in hopeful sort of manners, but that doesn't mean the weather does what we expect it to do on the first day of anything, right? Can you guys tell me that there's ever been a point where you have looked outside of your window without stepping into the elements and said, it's officially at this very moment shifted from spring to summer? Me too. It has that funny way of tricking us. There isn't an exact, precise moment, is there? It's sort of a gradual shift. Like it takes its time and it maneuvers through several things. It's a thawing, if you will. It's a thawing process. The air gets a little warmer, then it backs off, gets cool, warm, cool. But things begin to melt. Layers of frost begin to tear away. It's gradual. Days become a little longer. Sun is out a little longer. Maybe something bursts from the ground. But again, it's this process. Jesus says, no man knows the day or the hour, because he's trying to stress to us, I'm describing a season to you. It's not cut and dried. There's not this precise moment where you are going to, with anticipation, look up and say, oh my goodness, I've been waiting for this. He's here in an hour. It's never going to work like that. This is not how it goes. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, here he is, he's pointing back in history, kind of like he did with Antiochus. He's pointing back in history. Let me show you something you've already been through, that you already understand, something you've already seen, so I can make a comparison. And he says, but as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. And so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Pause there. That's a little frightening. By the way, this is a scripture text that pre-tribulation people use to basically say, this seems to suggest that you can't really predict it, so it could happen at any moment. As I said, all through along the way, I'm going to show you some of the hallmark scriptures that people use for each of these three positions. Tonight's not the night where I'm going to delve deeply into it, but at least I can give you some Easter eggs, so to speak, and all of the puns intended. But it says they didn't know. Well, here's the thing. How did you not know? Noah was preaching it. You saw him building a boat, because these things were happening gradually. Like the changing of seasons. How long was the boat sitting there before he starts filling it with animals? How long does it take to fill with animals? How long are you living inside of it before God shuts the door? How much life is happening? Well, there's no telling. There are people who were born and died before they ever saw Noah's Ark lift off of the ground from water. But the season was there. It was happening before their eyes. Of course it was. It says in the scripture that he built it and they mocked him. They saw it. And so too, we are living in a season in which it is actually happening. The shift is occurring. It is beginning. The tendrils are here. But people are still going to be surprised when the moment comes. Verse 40. 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, the other left. Watch, therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming, but know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour you do not expect. Listen, if somebody told me, I don't know about you, but if somebody said to me, Josie, look, I'm not going to tell you exactly when, but at some point tonight, time is now almost 6:45, some point tonight, there's going to be an armed man. He's going to walk up to your house and he's going to get his way in. Somehow, some way, he is going to make it past that door, past that lock system. He will get in there, and he will do what he is going to do. I can't tell you when, but he will come, and it will be tonight. How many of you are going to sleep? No way. Not in 1,000 years am I going to close my eyes. I'm going to grab whatever I possibly can to defend myself and my home and my family, and I am going to camp my behind right in a chair at my front door. Mama's going to be sitting out on the porch like, come on, what you got? Because I am going to be on red alert, because I've been given just enough information that I need to be ready. Can't make a prediction on precisely when, but I better be ready because I know what's going to happen. I don't need to know when. I know what. The what is this for the Christian? That Christ is coming back for a church without spot or blemish. And if that's not enough motivation to keep yourself alert and be ready for the moment so you don't miss it, so you're not caught unawares, then honestly, I don't know whatever will be good enough for us. But that's the reality, and that's what he compares it to. Verse 45, who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household to give food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find doing so. Assuredly, I say to you that he will make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master's delaying his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards, and the master of that servant will come on a day when he's not looking for him, and at an hour that he's not aware of, and will cut him in two, and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. And there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Wow, that's a dismal story. What he's basically saying is, if you just mess around because you think he's delaying his coming, he compares it to a servant and a master. Call it a boss and an employee. I know one thing for sure. I'm very careful at work, and the reason I'm very careful at work is because at any point in my workday, even though I'm remote, I will receive a call from one of my bosses, and the expectation is that I'm going to answer that not just in voice, but in video, to show that I'm at my desk and that I'm actually engaged in my work. And my response time is being measured. If that phone keeps ringing, the assumption is I've walked away. I'm not there. And those assumptions are going to give birth to some thoughts about my character and my work ethic. And he compares it to this. If you know that you've been made in charge of all of this responsibility, all of these employees and goods, and your master has said, I need you to take care of this until I come back to claim all of these things and reward you for the good efforts that you've put, and you decide, you know what? He hasn't come yet. I think I'm going to just lean back and use my power and enjoy this a little bit and just kind of ride this wave, and, I'm sure I can scramble and put it together when I see him on his way. No. He says what's going to end up happening is he's going to come exactly when you're not expecting him, and he's going to see everything that you're doing. And it says he's literally going to cut you in half, and he's going to give everything that belonged to you to someone else. Jesus is comparing his coming to this, that we as his servants have been given a great responsibility. And if we don't get on board with it, if we don't pull ourselves together, if we don't focus our minds, we might get caught taking advantage of what we thought was a great deal of time to pull ourselves together, and it's gone. The opportunity is gone. We're going to stop there for tonight. We've gone through Matthew 24, which is one of the most vivid, actually, aside from Revelation, sections of Scripture that describe the coming of Christ. Next week, we will pick it up with some other things, but we're going to continue on in our prophecy series. Who would like to